You know, for an airplane that was supposed to be a backup plan, it's lived an awful lot longer and gotten into an awful lot more attention and headlines and stories than it was probably supposed to. Today we're going to sweep up the second half of the Hornet story, that being the A-18 Super Hornet, also known as the Super Bug or the Rhino. This multi-role strike fighter is the backbone of the US Navy, the cheaper alternative to the F-35C, the successor to the Hornet family name, and supposedly the dropper of the most ridiculous munition possibly in aviation history. And all of these achievements are incredibly ironic, because while it bears the rough shape of the legacy Hornet, it is in effect a completely different airplane, and it almost wasn't even supposed to exist in the first place. After the Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the US Navy no longer had a need to police the world's oceans against possible Soviet aggression. The mass naval support for free trade was now optional, and the US could afford to uncheck the box because there was no longer a single large faction threatening to destroy it. So in turn, the US could afford to shrink its defense budget. Even for America, it's a lot harder to pick up the drive to spend money on boot-to-bottom technology if there are no bottoms to put your boot to. And if Congress can spend less money on things, you can bet your bottom they'll do it. So with defense budgets dwindling, the Navy needed to find ways to shave costs and make ends meet. And in the air power department, that meant everybody started looking at the Tomcat and its replacements like the Eye of Sauron. See, the Navy had been looking into getting a stealth fighter for its carrier decks to help push the usual American air dominance protocol forward. And the way they had planned on doing this was the Naval Advanced Tactical Fighter, or NATF program, which would be a spin-off of the Advanced Tactical Fighter program the Air Force chose from the YF-22 and YF-23. But the F-22 was worth a small national defense budget by itself, which was also getting cut due to the Soviets finding out that dead is in fact better than red. Convincing Congress to spend more money on it was one problem, and adapting an F-22 to a floating flat top was another just as bad. It was the classic issue of trying to convert an Air Force plane to a Navy plane, 1,000 extra pounds, and a great idea if you don't think about it at all. So by 1992, they had to drop the program. But wait, there's more. Because the Navy has more worries than just the lack of fighter firepower. The A-6 Intruder attack bomber airframes, which were in service since before Vietnam, were now ancient by this point, and viewing the problem through the lens of a single plane doesn't do it justice. Because the A-6 didn't do the job of one plane, it did the job of 3 planes. While the standard A-6 only served as a conventional and precision attack bomber, there were also the KA-6Ds built to supplement the Navy's mid-air refueling needs, and the EA-6B Prowlers responsible for holding up the rapidly developing frontier of dedicated electronic warfare planes. To that point, by September 10, 1993, the Navy had to retire the last of its KA-6D tankers, and the A-6s and EA-6Bs were expected to follow suit soon, leaving a total of 3 missing pieces in the Navy knockdown machine. However, the Navy wasn't really panicking about the A-6 because they'd been working on a replacement.
I may not have a brain, gentlemen, but I have an idea.
And that replacement was the McDonnell Douglas A-12 Avenger II Danger Dorito, a medium stealth bomber aircraft that could launch from carrier decks to provide the Navy's 5-star build-a-graveyard service. However, that program was suffering from major cost overruns and schedule delays, and after failing to convince then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney that all of it was worth it, Cheney would cancel the program in January of 1991. Now the Navy turns to all panic and no disco because they still need a stealth attack plane to fire off a carrier, and they would then try to push for a new AFX program to push an attack fighter with a high priority on stealth. But yet again, Dick Cheney's from the government and he's here to help, and so in January of 1993, the Clinton administration would again put the kibosh on the Navy's plans along with similar Air Force intentions, by merging them into the Joint Strike Fighter program. So the Navy is yet again back to square one trying to replace the A-6s. Oh, and they also have to take up the responsibilities of the now endangered F-14 Tomcats that Cheney had also shafted into limited quantities in his infinite wisdom.
You're dumb as a box of rocks.
While the Navy's newest airframe, the F-A-18 Hornets, could handle the fighter and attack job of the F-14 and A-6 in theory, that was theoretical at best because it had its own limits. It didn't have nearly enough gas for longer ops, and it reportedly had the same fuel burn rate as the Tomcat. Then it was limited on bring-back weight, or the amount of stuff that a plane could land on a carrier deck with, to where it couldn't beach itself onto the floating flat top with anything heavier than a load of air-to-air missiles aboard without snapping off its wings. Anything else would have to be ditched into the water, where the crew watching it could visibly be seen wincing in wasted taxpayer dollars. The Hornet also couldn't fill the mid-air refueling or electronic attack roles, so after the KA-6Ds retired, the Navy would become outright dependent on Air Force tankers. So now, the Navy would have to find a fighter to replace all of these aircraft to handle precision airstrikes, air-to-air combat, mid-air refueling, and electronic warfare while still being relatively cheap and probably easy to upgrade. This is ridiculous. It almost makes no sense. Luckily for us, neither does the military-industrial complex because they make dollars, and at this point the US defense contractors like frickin' Hogwarts, because they make magical things happen when you need a rogue group of wizards casting fireball all cleaned up.
Alright now, Alucard, clean that up. Oh.
And if you don't have the budget to make something new, what do? You make something already there a little bit better, allowing the Navy to fill in the gap in their air power while still conserving funding for the Joint Strike Fighter. If you're not picking up what I'm putting down, I'm trying to tell you we're about to find out what happens when you tell the military-industrial complex to copy my homework but make it a little different. One of the biggest rules of warfare: if you're not cheating, you're not trying, and America's about to change its application from taking the test to making the test. Only one problem: to select that upgrade, Congress wanted to make the Navy go through the standard operating procedure. You know, taking years and years to request proposals, pick the top few, have the developers build flying prototypes, then hold a fly-off to pick a winner, and then actually adapt it to service conditions, all while teething out issues and risking budget overruns on the whole way through that Congress might turn around and cancel the project for again. And the Navy took one look at that and said, ain't nobody got time for that. But they also can't break the rules, so what option does the Navy have? That's right, they bend them.
The code is more what you'd call guidelines than actual rules.
Instead of asking the whole industry for proposals, they said if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and went straight to the companies that already made them planes that worked, aka Grumman and McDonnell Douglas with their F-14 and F-A-18. These aircraft would have to be based on existing platforms so they could be cleverly designated with the common military-industrial complex loophole that is giving a new plane an old name to cheat rule makers and bean counters into believing that something was lower risk and enough of a reward. But they would also have to make them better enough to handle any new things wanting the smoke for the next 20 years. Grumman would start off by showing up with an upgrade for the F-14 called the Quick Strike Package. This would basically bolt on ground attack software and some modifications to do roughly the same things as the Strike Eagle, but the Navy wanted more. So Grumman naturally turns around and says, oh, you want better? Hold my beer, and dials it up to 11 to make the Super Tomcat 21. The improved Super Tom would get more powerful engines, added fuel tanks, a better radar and bigger flaps, a dedicated targeting pod station, and better situational awareness via new pilot support systems and cockpit designs. And because they went straight to an 11 instead of like an 8 or something, now it costs too much. So the Navy's all like, okay, fine. McDonald's, what do you got for me? And turns over to look at McDonnell Douglas. Mickey D's at this point was now financially struggling after all the wasted investment on the A-12 that got canceled, and since they also needed to keep costs low, they were more likely to come up with a low-cost plane. And even better, they had a plan.
Time to enact my genius plan.
Throwback to July of 1987, the Secretary of Defense issues a memorandum to McDonnell Douglas to undergo a series of studies on how it could improve the Hornet airframe to handle modern threats into the 2000s and beyond. These studies would be called the Hornet 2000 program, and after consulting with the Navy, they would begin scaling down some of the lofty goals to put a focus on the dollar sign while still being an improvement. The basic Hornet did have its flaws, but there wasn't an overly complicated or hugely expensive solution that was required for any of them. Pretty much every core flaw could be handled by just putting the bug on steroids. More gas? Make more room. Raise the bring-back weight? Add bigger, stronger wings. Want to tuck in some more boot-to-bottom tech while you're at it? Well, the bigger wings and some bigger engines will do you nicely. The only thing they really needed to add was a way to make it look a little smaller on radar, better known as giving it a reduced radar cross-section. Basically, if you're not catching my drift, they're gonna give the Hornet the Jason Voorhees treatment. Bigger, stronger, stealthier. This is gonna be the aerial equivalent of RoboCop. Take whatever it needs to work and make it better than before.
We can rebuild him. We have the technology.
So after pulling back on the plans for things like canards, full radar stealth, and internal weapons bays, the Navy selected the Super Hornet program as a winner in July of 1992. But the Navy would be the only one who wanted the soon-to-be Super Hornet. The Marines decided to focus their funding on the Joint Strike Fighter, and they wouldn't participate in the program. So every Hornet the Marine Corps still has in service today is actually a legacy Hornet. The Navy also offered the Hornet 2000 to several European counterparts, but they decided to stick to their own programs and make the Rafale tail in the Eurofighter. So the Navy would make both the Super Hornet and the A-18G Growler on their own. But aside from those speed bumps in the road, the development would be mostly uneventful, so much so that the project was actually completed under weight, under budget, and on schedule, which is like the holy trifecta of aerospace engineering.
Houston, we have no problems.
The development contract would be signed in December of 1992, and the first prototype was finished by mid-1995. That prototype would first fly that November, and after the 1997 merger where Boeing bought out Old McDonald's aircraft farm and stamped their name on the project, the first Block 1 Superbugs would enter fleet service in 1999. And the literal next second, something came out of left field and would smack the program with an audit.
The IRS? No, thank you.
On July 7, 1999, a report was published by the Department of Defense's Inspector General that resulted from a senator getting very enthusiastic when he learned of a flaw in the Super Hornet. Basically, what had happened was that the Block 1 Super Hornets had been accepted into service with a known defect called wing drop at the time, but now more commonly called abrupt wing stall, or AWS. This audit resulted in an aerodynamic study starting in the spring of 1999, and it revealed that at angles of attack, or pitch-up angles relative to going straight forwards, above 12 degrees, one of the Super Hornet's wings would effectively stop working and drop like it was made of lead, in a phenomenon more commonly called the falling leaf. Super Hornets wouldn't land at these angles, but during carrier catapult takeoffs, the Super Hornets would routinely reach 12 degrees and go up to 15 degrees, which, with this issue active, would cause one wing to drop and the Super Hornet to snap into the ocean right off the deck. However, according to the tests, this problem would happen regardless of altitude between 0.55 and 0.95 times the speed of sound, and it was a complicated result of two different aerial issues, one that caused a loss of control, and another that caused one wing to stall out earlier than the other. The roll control loss started all the way near the front of the wing on the larger and reshaped leading edge root extensions, or LERXs, aka those flanges stretching forward of the wing. Just as with the original Hornet, these would cause the air sweeping out from underneath them and the air running down the length of that specially shaped wing section to spin up and over the top into a vortex. Once they got up top, these vortices would suplex the air back down onto the wing to fix the otherwise lack of roll control at these angles of attack. What they later found out was that the airflow from a pair of vents in the leading edge extensions would disrupt and weaken the vortices the LERXs deliberately created. These vents had been explicitly added to improve low-speed handling, improve lift as long as the engines were on and pulling in air, and reducing the buffeting on the vertical tail, so closing them took away most of these bonuses. However, closing them actually increased lift at those high angles of attack and reduced approach speed by 1 knot, which is not all that big in the grand scheme of things considering it had an approach speed of like 150 to 160 miles an hour. The Navy had learned about this issue in testing and accidentally solved it by closing the vent doors they had installed after wind tunnel simulations had missed it. But this was only half the problem. The other part of the aerodynamic turned pterodynamic issue was that the new wing folding hinge the Super Hornets were built with would cause different airflow patterns on either wing, creating an uneven balance of lift in those heavily nose-up angles that would then cause the one wing to just fall over. And this senator probably thought he was going to advance his career or something because he thought the Navy had decided to hastily overlook this flaw during testing and push it into service anyways. However, he would find himself slapped in the face with the good old Uno reverse card because the Navy had followed the proper procedures during the test and evaluation process. And considering how desperately the Navy needed its capability gaps filled, they made the judgment call that this issue was a medium and acceptable level of risk. So following the old adage of a good solution today is better than a perfect solution tomorrow, they brought the design into service anyways. So, since the Navy had in fact followed proper procedures, the audit didn't find any issues and that senator probably went home at least a little disappointed.
はい、お前だ。でも、私は。
The Navy would later add a porous or hole-filled cover for the wing hinges, and by September of 2001, the Block 1 Super Hornets would reach initial operating capability just in time to start handling the fallout from 9/11. They would go on to finally stretch their sea wheels on their first operational cruise aboard CVN-72 USS Abraham Lincoln in July of 2002, before being already thrust into combat that November over Iraq. At this point in time, the US was still enforcing the no-fly zones in Operations Northern Watch and Southern Watch that were started in the mid to late 1990s to protect Iraq's Kurdish residents by preventing air attacks and blowing up anything that shot back. Simple stuff. VFA 115, the Eagles, would take the Super Hornet into combat against ground targets and erase a couple of surface-to-air insults to the local grid squares before returning home again without issue. However, there wouldn't actually be many Block 1 Super Hornets. In fact, most of the Super Hornets we see today are the Block 2s. These went into production in 2005 and were first delivered the April of that year. And since they are a higher block number, naturally you would expect they'd come with upgrades, such as the Joint Helmet-Mounted Queuing System, which lets you aim your heat-seeking missiles by eye and prove that looks can in fact kill you, along with avionics and situational awareness upgrades, plus a degree of sensor meshing to hand off control of its weapons, such as the AMRAAMs, to other friendly units for things like guidance. Because teamwork makes the dream work, and the dream is a sky full of coral reefs. And while the Super Hornets had been fitted with the revamped Legacy Hornet mechanical radar that was the AN-APG-73, this would be later replaced after the 30th production lot with an active electronically scanned array, or AESA radar, the AN-APG-79. Basically, the differences between mechanical and AESA radars is that an AESA relies on electronically steering its output instead of mechanically, and can function like multiple radars in a single unit if you really want it to, which Boeing claims is the world's first tactical multi-mode AESA radar. Kind of a bold statement, considering all AESAs at least have the capability to be multi-mode, and that it came out after both the F-22 and the Mitsubishi F-2, the first plane to ever field an AESA radar.
How original.
But regardless of the impact of either overly specific or just outright terrible corporate advertising, the Super Hornets would finish taking over the roles of the Tomcats in 2006, and the Block 2 Superbugs would be fully operational by December of 2007. Its service life would be mostly uneventful aside from constant operations over the Middle East until June 18, 2017, when an F-A-18E got an intercept before the Kid and turned a Syrian Su-22 fitter into a piece of modern art. And that kill was historic for 3 reasons. 1, this was the Super Hornets' first and only air-to-air kill. 2, it was the last recorded air-to-air kill to date by the US against a manned aircraft. And 3, it was the first American air-to-air kill in almost 20 years, being the first one since 1999 over Yugoslavia. But aside from that, the Super Hornet wouldn't see any air-to-air action outside of the movie theaters, and the last of the Block 2s would be delivered by April of 2020, the same year the Blue Angels swapped over from the Legacy Hornets to the Supers. But 2024 was basically Christmas year for the Super Hornet because they got some special new toys for themselves. In July of 2024, Super Hornets would be the first aircraft to equip the Navy's newest long-range air-to-air missile, the AIM-174B Gunslinger. And if you don't know what this missile is yet, well, sit down because I'm about to learn you a thing. The AIM-174 is a technically surface-to-air but actually surface-to-everything missile that we tore off a warship and bolted underneath a fighter jet so we can remind the nearest horizon that even the sunset can get the smoke if we want it to. Which also means that your Super Hornet can turn your aircraft into a coral reef from damn near, if not outright double the range of the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, hit ground targets if it's got nothing better to do, and since that warship missile was compatible with the Aegis Defense Network, you know, the record holder for the longest anti-satellite headshot in history, the Super Hornet can hand off the Gunslinger to the Aegis for targeting and guidance. But the Gunslinger isn't actually the most ridiculous thing the Super Hornet can or has thrown at somebody. I only have this story by word of mouth right now, and there's no official coverage or disclosure of it. Like, it's pretty much just a Navy folktale at this point. But if this is true, let's just say I hope it's true. In February of 2024, the carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower was stationed in the Persian Gulf to handle airstrikes on the Houthis who have been lighting up shipping vessels going through the region. And one day at about 2:30 in the morning, a Super Hornet was getting ready for some night ops with a pilot who apparently had a reputation for being a real by-the-book, no messing around type of guy. The Marines on board had apparently planned a surprise for him because they were all giggling like a pack of schoolgirls, but nobody on deck really thought anything of it. Fast forward to 10 minutes later, and that Super Hornet is getting ready to load up on the catapult in like the next 5 minutes, and the Marines and the ordnance techs start really hastily removing a bomb from one of the Hornet's underwing pylons and drag out this early 1900s era cast iron bathtub and mount that thing up to where the bomb used to be. The pilot's probably looking over at these guys like, what the hell are you doing? But before he has any time to protest it, he gets called up onto the catapult for launch. Everybody on deck begins quietly losing their shit, and right as the plane launches, the captain finally notices and orders them to come around for a flyby to observe that, yes, his Marines did in fact mount a bathtub to one of his strike fighters. He comes down from the bridge to the flight deck and he's all like,
What did you do?
All right, but you can't be mad at me.
What did you do?
because the captain's trying to be mad at them, but at the same time, he's just completely baffled by the sheer level of tomfoolery that has just transpired aboard his ship. At this point, he's just asking questions like, where did you even get this? How did you get it aboard my ship without me noticing? And how did you manage to any percent speed run, mounting it to one of my aircraft right before takeoff? Because this is exactly as insane as it sounds like. It is the holy trifecta of household appliances being thrown at the enemy. It's the revenge of the Skyraider. First, the Navy threw everything in the kitchen sink at the North Koreans, and then they flushed out communism with a toilet bomb against the North Vietnamese. Now here's the Super Hornet telling the Houthis to clean up their act with a whole new take on a bath bomb. The Sacred Trinity is complete now. I could die happy knowing that the military never changes. And when that aircrew came back an hour later, the Bathtub was gone, and the Wizzos supposedly confirmed that they had dropped it with the rest of the payload over an enemy missile location. The pilot was pissed, the ship's captain was pissed but impressed, and the Marines and the ordnance techs were all, quote, on cloud nine, knowing they had just sham-shielded their way into immortality by dropping a fucking tub. Honestly, the worst part about this story is that, like I said, it's not officially on record anywhere, and there are zero pictures and zero evidence of this actually happening, despite the thorough documentation of the Eisenhower's deployment during that time. But if somebody out there has pictures of this, please, for the love of all that is good, email them to me. I am begging you. I know that it was still dark out and it was early in the morning, but this is 2024 and I know at least one of you had a low exposure camera on your iPhone. Send me that picture, and in the meantime, I'll get to telling everybody what this plane is capable of when it's not inheriting the legacy of memes. And speaking of legacies, while the Super Hornet may be based on the legacy bug, this is the point where I finally get to clarify how it is basically a completely different plane. While the Super Bug originally inherited 90% of the legacy's avionics, only about 30% of its structural parts were shared with the legacy bug. This was primarily due to its larger airframe, which, instead of being just upscaled across the board, was actually taken and sized up piece by piece only as necessary to save on end unit cost. The wings were sized up by 25%, the horizontal tail by 36%, and the vertical tail, which was originally going to stay the same, by 15%. And despite having a fairly heavy clean wing loading of 95.1 pounds per square foot, or 464 metric knot pounds per square metric knot foot, the larger and stiffer wings gave the Super Hornets a lower approach speed for landing and triple the bring-back weight, so they wouldn't have to worry about ripping their wings off when they belly flopped onto the carrier deck with anything other than a load of missiles. Using a mostly aluminum frame with composite wings, the Super Hornet would increase the Legacy Hornet's empty weight of 24,395 pounds by nearly 3.5 tons to 30,564 pounds, and from its maximum takeoff weight of 51,900 pounds to 66,000 pounds. That gave it room for 3,600 pounds, or just over 1,600 metric knot pounds more gas stored internally, giving it more internal fuel than a clean C model F-15. And that much extra dyno juice translates to a 50% longer ferry range of 1,807 miles and a 20 to 30% longer combat radius of 661 miles over the basic bug. And to push that ass and burn that gas, the Legacy Hornet's F404 engines were also upgraded to the Super Hornet's F414s, which now pumped out 20,729 pounds or 92.2 Newton death wishes each when sitting completely still at sea level, or just an outright maximum of 22,000 pounds or 97.8 Newton death wishes each. That gives it a thrust-to-weight ratio somewhere just over 1.1 and a top speed right around Mach 1.8, which isn't that fast considering some of its counterparts and definitely considering its predecessor, the Tomcat, but that's fine because this thing was made for medium beyond visual range combat, low-speed dogfighting, and making bad guys apologize to their GPS coordinates, all for the low price of roughly $80 million in today monies. That makes it the only American fighter jet that costs less than an $82.5 million F-35A. Because apparently a stealth multi-role jet that can do borderline any job out there gets the silver medal in the ranking order for cheapest modern fighter jet. Reality is stranger than fiction, I guess.
That escalated quickly.
The Super Bug would get another pair of underwing weapon stations over the basic bug for a total of 11, and some of them would be reinforced for heavier enemy-to-crater conversion catalysts. Such exotic devices can include AMRAMs, AIM-9 Sidewinders, the Gunslingers, Paveways, batteries, JDAMs, JSOWs, LRASMs, 480-gallon fuel tanks, buddy refueling pods, and much, much more. And on top of its perfectly centered nose-mounted M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon with 412 rounds, which is somehow smaller than its predecessor's 578 rounds despite being a bigger plane, the Navy has also been looking into getting this thing a laser pod. This isn't a Swiss Army knife, this is a Swiss Navy knife. And despite having so many options, it is a really easy plane to keep in the fight. Being an upgrade over the cheap-to-maintain Legacy Hornet, this thing received that same DNA and improved on it like it came straight out of Gattaca. It is more expensive to maintain at 40% the cost of a Tomcat instead of 25% like the basic bug, but the Super Bug uses a lot fewer parts and it can be fixed fast. A crew of 8 to 12 maintainers can take a Super Hornet from boneyard condition, no electronics, no working engines, the like, and bring it back to flight-ready condition in as little as 20 to 23 hours on a carrier deck and less than half that at 8 to 10 hours on land. But that's not even their best, because from what I've been told, Super Hornet crews also train in what I'm going to call Paul Revere runs.
The British are coming! The British are coming!
Because these are what happen when the enemy's about to show up and you gotta figure out how many lanterns you're gonna hang over their cemetery. In these midnight rides, a crew can compact that maintenance window of in the boneyard to digging the graveyard down to as little as 5.5 hours. Pause. The A-10 is known for being the king of cheap maintenance. I mean, Desert Storm, most of the A-10s that were shot took less than 4 hours to fix. And meanwhile, the Super Hornet is over here going from completely dead to making you dead in 5.5. And while those processes are probably not the same in length or number of steps, that's still a lot of progress in a comparable amount of time. In fact, from what I've been told, most parts on the Super Hornets can be replaced in as little as 30 to 45 minutes, with the most difficult things to fix up being the landing gear and the wheels. Those might take a little longer if you're not hot-footing it. And that's assuming you have to fix it at all in the first place, because not only does the Super Hornet have its fancy-schmancy reduced radar cross-section with the new square intakes, it also has its IDECM, which stands for Integrated Defensive Electronic Countermeasures. This includes its countermeasure dispensers, an onboard jammer, because why hide from a radar missile when you can punch its seeker head in the eyeballs, and a towed decoy. These towed decoys are the earlier versions of the same concept applied to the F-35, the AN/ALE-50s, which act as a tasty target for missiles by either jamming the launching radar, jamming the missile radar, or role-playing as a bard from Dungeons & Dragons and rolling to seduce the missile into mating with it instead of the superbug.
Those are beautiful beads. I have a set just like it, you know.
It has an automatic landing system that's literally called the Magic Carpet, on top of the old basic bugs assisted takeoff setting for catapult launches that sets the elevators to the pull-up position, literally letting the pilot say, "Look ma, no hands." But when the pilot needs to take hold of the stick and say, "To heck with it, I'll do it myself," that's when the Super Hornet breaks out its secret weapon, a quadruple redundant fly-by-wire control system that it can use to pull up to 7.5 Gs before suffering from any major strain. And if the wing hinge cover was what the Superbug used to defeat the falling leaf's airflow issues, its fly-by-wire controls are what it uses to tell the laws of physics to go pick on somebody else. This system takes all the control surfaces and blends them together in what is called a total flight control system integration, which takes all 12 control surfaces, the rudders, ailerons, stabilators, the 2 flaps on the front of each wing and the 1 on the back, plus the spoilers on the leading edge root extensions, and uses all of them to control the plane across different speeds and maneuvers. For example, this replaced the basic Bug's dedicated air brake with both the rudders and leading edge root extension spoilers to slow down, and in certain cases, it also won't use the ailerons at all for roll control, just the spoilers and stabilators. The Rhino's definitely not the first plane to use this setup, but it was the first one to have the system built around using an unlimited angle of attack in all flight regimes. It is because of that exact power that, despite the added weight, it is still maneuverable enough to give most other planes a code brown in a lower speed sustained dogfight. In fact, a skilled Super Hornet pilot can even beat an F-16 in a one-circle fight, better known as a rolling scissors, where angle of attack matters more than sustained turn rate. And like both the F-16 and the Legacy Hornet, the fly-by-wire system also adds the leading and trailing edge flaps to improve the turn rate and get better at going low and slow, as well as drooping the ailerons on takeoff takeoff to add to the flaps. But unlike the Legacy Hornet, which had a mechanical backup system, the Superbug felt confident enough to do away with the extra bulk and switch to a fourth set of wires. As an added bonus, the Rhino's controls are also somewhat adaptive to battle damage, meaning that if the aircraft loses a part of a control surface or all of one, the rest of the control system will adapt to cover for the lost parts, within limits of course. And unfortunately, speaking of limits, the Super Hornet may be a very well-rounded aircraft, but if there's one enemy that nothing can defeat, it's the passage of time. Despite the fact that the Super Hornet was designed to be an improvement over its predecessor, it has somehow been aging worse. After 10 years in service, the Legacy Hornets had a mission availability rate of 59%, and after the same amount of time, the Super Hornets were down to 41%. So what gives? Well, for one thing, the Rhino's been doing hot laps around the Middle East for years, taking out everybody on the search for the find out part of the graph. There were also all the delays in the F-35's development, and a DoD audit on September 29, 2021 for the Navy and Marines not following up on the required corrosion inspections of the Hornet fleet. But those are all additive issues to the fact that the Superbug came with the exact same service life as the basic bug. The Rhino only came off the factory floor with a 6,000-hour lifespan, and that was supposed to last at 20 years somehow. But the first one to reach 6,000 hours did so in April of 2017, 2 months before its 15th birthday.
Happy birthday to me!
And since you can't have air dominance with planes falling apart on you, the Navy would go ahead and start planning out service life modifications in 2018 to hit the Super Hornets with a dose of necromancy.
Shot the dock. Was it vampire DNA?
It was a spa day, a deep tissue massage, and a face mask. Of vampire DNA.
Super Hornets would start rolling out of those voodoo plans on February 6, 2020, with their lifespans pushed out to 7,500 hours. However, the plan was to squeeze up to 10,000 hours out of each plane at the program's full maturity, which was expected to happen in December of 2022 and come with a slew of upgrades for the next version of the Super Hornets. However, the first 2 models to receive the max upgrade pack wouldn't get it until June 28th of 2024. And in the meantime, it started getting a reputation for being more on the receiving end of the American boomstick than some of its enemies. 3 A-18 Super Hornets have been lost to various incidents recently, all of which were assigned to the USS Harry S. Truman aircraft carrier. Some people actually think the Truman is cursed because the christening wine bottle didn't break on its first try when they commissioned the ship, but I really don't think we need superstitions to believe it after this. The first one went down after the USS Gettysburg somehow misidentified it and shot a missile at it. Then the second was lost during evasive maneuvers against a Houthi drone attack, which caused an F-18 and its tug dolly to go over the edge. Then a third would go overboard after an arrested landing failure.
Comedy comes in threes.
Then there are some technical hangups that continue to limit the Super Hornet's potential. When the Block 2 was introduced, one of the things it was supposed to get was an external infrared search and track, or IRST pod, which is a sensor that lets you track and find aircraft at short to medium range and provides some means of allowing a plane to track more stealthy aircraft. This pod was going to be the ASG-34AV-1 pod that's basically a fuel tank with an IRST sensor strapped onto the front, which right off the bat already sounds like a terrible idea. I mean, I could present exactly one plane where we tried combining the gas and the other things into the pod, and that's the B-58 Hustler. You ask me how well that idea went. Oh right, they split them up later so they could ditch the gas and the nukes separately. With a pod like this, you can't ditch it to save weight from maneuvering because then you lose the sensor, and since it's a fuel tank, it's probably only a matter of time before some rookie pilot drops his tanks as a force of habit and then starts wondering where his heat sensor went.
My brain was like, where'd he go?
And its track record so far would seem to prove that it is a terrible idea. Not only does the sensor reduce the fuel capacity of the pod from 480 gallons to 340, but apparently the sensor breaks, on average, once every 14 hours. It's supposed to last 40 hours before it needs to be fixed, which still doesn't really sound like that long of a lifespan to me to begin with, and it probably doesn't help that 20 to 30% of the parts failed to meet performance specifications. When they were testing this pod, it usually needed to be tech supported, i.e. turned off and on again several times before it would actually start working, and Navy maintenance crews would usually have to phone a friend from Lockheed to fix it. And the icing on the cake for all of this is that somehow each one of these pods costs $16.6 million a piece.
Total fustercluck.
That was in 2019, and the operational testing was delayed to the second quarter of fiscal year 2024. It would actually achieve its initial operating capability in November of 2024, but the planned full rate production in January of 2025 was then delayed to at least March. And as far as I'm able to find, the Super Hornet still doesn't have that IRST pod. It also doesn't have a lot of export customers. The only people that have bought into the Super Hornet program outside of the US are the Australians. It almost made it it into service with Canada, but it got ruled out of their fighter competition in December of 2021 because Boeing did a Boeing thing and hit the find out part of the graph themselves a few years earlier.
Found out the hard way.
Back in April of 2016, Bombardier won a contract to sell 125 of its CS-100 110-seat narrow-body passenger jets to the U.S. airline company Delta, which they accepted because Boeing had no comparable alternative. The next year, Boeing turned around and sued Bombardier under the allegations of receiving illegal subsidies from the Canadian government and price dumping the CS-100, which resulted in an initial plan to impose a nearly 220% and later almost 300% tariff on these aircraft by the U.S. International Trade Commission pending investigation. However, by January 26, 2018, the ITC's investigation realized that Boeing was full of it and would have to suck it up, along with the tariffs being dropped. However, the suit still came at a cost to Bombardier and Canada, that being that the CS-100 product line was effectively sold to Airbus when they took a majority stake in the program and then set up the U.S. sales for construction in Alabama. But the allegations, being what most sane individuals would refer to as a dick move, rightfully pissed off the Canadian government and people to the point that Boeing actually got the Quebecois and the Albertans to agree on something. For my American viewers who know nothing about Canada, that is about the same as if California and Texas decided they were pissed off enough at somebody that it was time to be on the same page. And Canada remembered that, so while the official reasoning was that it didn't meet their requirements, I'm willing to bet that little scandal probably played into the decision to not let it through, as it should have.
Canada!
However, the program might see some revitalization from the US Navy, Australia, and Kuwait, and a strong maybe on Finland, because these countries were eyeing the Rhinos after their newest model that I mentioned earlier started coming out, the Block 3. First flying on the 5th of August 2013, the Block 3 Super Hornets were made to come with a whole slew of their own upgrades. These were first going to have an internal IRST, a missile and laser warning system, better engines, that 10,000-hour necromantic lifespan without the necromancy, directed infrared countermeasures, which would basically shove a laser beam into the eyes of any heat-seeking missile and blind it off course, over-wing conformal fuel tanks or CFTs, and a really awkward stealth weapons pod that would turn the centerline pylon into a 4-mount rack and the Rhino into a flying D's nuts joke. But I say originally because it already started losing parts before even entering Navy service, like the conformal fuel tanks on January 6, 2021. Those overwing tanks would have given the Block 3s an extra 515 gallons of fuel and tacked on about 300 miles or 480 metric knot miles of extra range. And those tanks came with an added bonus. They were really neat because thanks to their placement and design, they would have helped generate enough lift to offset the added drag, making them some of the most efficient conformal tanks of their type. However, the Block 3s were not like the Block 1s, especially with the CFTs. Due to cost and schedule overruns, quote-unquote performance issues, and the fact that they overstressed the airframe during catapult launches, the CFTs were removed from the airframe along with the better engines and the missile-blinding lasers. Land-based Block 3s could still probably use the CFTs, though. Australia was actually looking at getting the CFTs with their own Block 3s, and Kuwait was looking at doing without them, but getting some of the other upgrades. But the Navy would do without, and the first 2 Block 3 jets were delivered to the service in June of 2020 to start trying out whatever tricks they could get their hands on. The Navy would then sign a contract for 78 brand new Block 3 Hornets to be delivered between 2021 and 2024, with the first of these delivered on September 14, 2021. But this wouldn't be a Boeing airplane if there wasn't a Boeing problem. The Navy stalled on picking up the last order of 20 Block 3s because Boeing was quoting a price tag per plane so frickin' high that it almost would have been cheaper for the Navy to buy more F-35Cs. See, the last of these planes were also supposed to come with a technical data package to let the Navy better sustain their fleet. But Boeing being Boeing was being stingy about their intellectual property rights and kept going back and forth. Negotiations took several years to reach a verdict, and thanks to the inflation during that time, the price per plane went up. And so when Boeing finally accepted the terms and just sold the damn jets on March 19, 2024, the Navy had to compromise out of necessity to fill their timetables and settled for ordering only 17 Super Hornets instead of the planned 20. Congress still isn't happy about that, but at this point, who isn't disappointed in Boeing?
We're all disappointed.
Those jets should start delivery at the end of 2026 and finish by the spring of 2027. But if nobody else orders Block 3s, then this may be the end of the Hornet bloodline. Boeing announced that if they could not find additional customers for the aircraft, they would be shuttering the production lines in 2027 after the deliveries conclude. So in summation, the Super Hornet is arguably a very fitting successor to the Hornet name and handles its multi-role nature well. It might not be the most glorious of aircraft, and it might not do overly well in any particular job. But just like its predecessor, it's not supposed to. It's just good enough to fill the job of a workhorse and leave the job of being the first and last thing you ever see to the weapons coming off of its rails. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed. I really hope somebody sends me a picture of the Super Hornet slinging that bathtub soon.